A Black War veteran is humiliated by police during a routine stop, but what they see on his table leaves them speechless. You might think this is just another case of abuse of power, but the ending will seriously surprise you. James Washington sat quietly at his corner table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. At 63, his face carried the kind of dignity that comes not from trying to command respect, but from having lived a life worthy of it. The deep lines around his eyes spoke of both laughter and hardship, while his straight posture, even while seated, hinted at his military background. His Vietnam veteran jacket, though aged, was immaculately maintained, each patch and button telling its own story of service and sacrifice. The morning crowd moved around him in their usual rhythm, young professionals typing away on laptops, retired couples sharing breakfast, and the occasional parent wrestling with energetic toddlers. James had chosen this particular cafe not just for its coffee, which he admitted was exceptional, but for its peaceful atmosphere. Here, he could sit for hours with his thoughts, occasionally jotting down memories in the worn notebook he carried everywhere. The bell above the door chimed, its cheerful tone contrasting sharply with the heavy footsteps that followed. Officers Mike Sullivan and Brad Cooper entered, their presence immediately commanding attention from the cafe's patrons. Sullivan, the senior officer, carried himself with the kind of authority that came from 15 years on the force, while Cooper, barely 2 years into the job, seemed to compensate for his inexperience with an excess of bravado. The change in the cafe's atmosphere was subtle but palpable. Conversations grew quieter, and several patrons found sudden interest in their phones or coffee cups. James remained focused on his writing, his pen moving steadily across the page. Though his military-trained senses had registered the officer's arrival the moment they stepped through the door. Sandra Martinez, a regular who worked at the library across the street, watched the scene unfold from her table near the counter. She had noticed James during his previous visits, always polite, always alone, and always writing in that notebook. Today, something felt different. The way the officers scanned the room, their gazes lingering a bit too long on James, sent a chill down her spine. Behind the counter, Marcus Chin, the cafe's manager, was arranging a fresh batch of muffins when he noticed the tension building in his usually peaceful establishment. 6 years of managing Carter's had given him an intuitive sense for approaching trouble, and something about the officer's body language set off warning bells in his mind. Officer Sullivan's voice cut through the morning murmur. "Sir, could you look up from what you're doing for a moment?" The words were polite enough, but the tone carried an edge that made several customers wince. James looked up slowly, his expression remaining neutral as he carefully closed his notebook. "Is there something I can help you with, officers?" His voice was steady, carrying the kind of calm that comes from having faced far worse situations than this. The rich baritone of his words carried across the now silent cafe, drawing every eye in the room. Cooper took a step forward, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holster, a gesture that wasn't lost on James or the other patrons. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind telling us what you're writing there so intently?" The absurdity of the question hung in the air. Several customers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while Marcus paused in his work, keeping one eye on the developing situation. Sandra gripped her coffee cup tighter, her knuckles turning white. James's response was measured, each word carefully chosen. "I'm working on my memoirs, officer." Just a veteran putting his memories on paper. He gestured to his jacket, the patches and pins clearly visible in the morning light. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "A lot of people can buy military jackets these days. We're going to need to see some ID." The implication in his voice was clear. He didn't believe James's story. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. A young woman at a nearby table had her phone out, recording discreetly. James reached slowly for his wallet, his movements deliberate and calm, though decades of military service had taught him to recognize the dangerous edge this situation was walking. As he moved to retrieve his ID, his arm brushed against the table, causing a small object to slide from beneath his notebook. The morning sun caught it just right, sending a gleam across the room that caught Marcus's attention. The manager's eyes widened as he recognized what it was, a Distinguished Service Cross, one of the nation's highest military honors, partially hidden under the veterans' papers. The metal's presence on the table was about to change everything, but in that moment, as James carefully pulled out his identification, the weight of prejudice and assumption hung heavy in the air of Carter's coffee shop. The story of how a simple metal would transform not just this moment, but an entire community, was about to unfold in ways none of the present company could imagine. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the counter, his movement drawing the officer's attention. As he approached, the morning sun continued to dance off the metal, creating a silent testament to service and sacrifice that would soon become impossible to ignore. The next few moments would test not just James's dignity, but the very fabric of their community's understanding of respect, prejudice, and the quiet heroes who walk among them. In the distance, a siren wailed, its sound filtering through the cafe's windows. But inside, time seemed to stand still as Marcus prepared to speak. The simple act of a manager standing up for what's right was about to set in motion a chain of events that would ripple through their small town, touching lives in ways both profound and unexpected. James sat perfectly still, his hands now resting on the table, the morning light catching both his service medals and the wisdom in his eyes. He had faced combat, lost friends, and carried the weight of war's memories for decades. Now, in a small coffee shop on an ordinary Wednesday morning, he was about to face another kind of battle, one fought not with weapons, but with dignity, truth, and the power of silent strength. The silence in Carter's coffee shop held a weight of its own, pressing against the windows and wrapping around each patron like an invisible shroud. James's steady gaze never wavered, even as Marcus approached with purposeful steps that seemed to echo against the hardwood floors. The manager's movement created ripples in the tension-filled air, like a stone dropped into still water. "Officers," Marcus began, his voice carrying a quiet authority that surprised even himself, "I believe there's something you should see." He gestured toward the metal that now lay fully exposed on the table, its brass surface catching the sunlight and sending fractals of golden light dancing across the ceiling. The Distinguished Service Cross told its own story, one of valor, sacrifice, and courage under fire. Officer Sullivan's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as his eyes fell on the metal. For a moment, the tough exterior of law enforcement cracked, revealing a glimpse of the man beneath the badge. Cooper, the younger officer, took an involuntary step backward, his hand falling away from his belt as recognition dawned in his eyes. The metal on the table wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a bridge across the chasm of misunderstanding that had opened in the cafe. Each scratch on its surface, each subtle wear mark, spoke of moments when James had put everything on the line for his country, the same country whose servants now stood before him, questioning his right to sit peacefully in a coffee shop. Around them, the cafe's atmosphere began to transform. Sandra Martinez had tears in her eyes, though she tried to hide them behind her coffee cup. The young woman with the phone was still recording, but her hand trembled slightly as she captured this moment of truth unfolding before her. Even the morning sunlight seemed to pause in its journey across the floor, as if waiting to see how this scene would play out. James slowly reached out and picked up the metal, his movements deliberate and graceful. "Vietnam, 1971, he said softly, his voice carrying memories of jungle heat and helicopter rotors. "Just outside of Quang Tri Province. My unit was pinned down, taking heavy fire." He held the metal up, letting it catch the light. "This isn't about the medal, officers. It's about the men I served with, the ones who didn't come home." The words hung in the air like morning mist, heavy with unspoken stories. Officer Sullivan's face had lost its harsh edge, replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. Cooper had gone pale, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of real courage. Marcus stepped closer to the table, his presence offering silent support. "Mr. Washington has been coming here for months," he said, addressing the officers but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "He writes his memoirs here because he says the atmosphere helps him remember the good times, not just the difficult ones." An older man at a nearby table suddenly stood up, his coffee forgotten. "I served too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Different war, different place, but we all wore the same flag." He turned to face James, snapping off a crisp salute that spoke volumes about muscle memory and respect. James returned the salute with perfect form, the movement as natural as breathing. The exchange transformed the cafe into something sacred, a place where truth and dignity had triumphed over prejudice and assumption. The morning light continued its journey across the floor, but now it illuminated a different scene. Officer Sullivan cleared his throat, struggled for words, then finally managed to speak. "Sir, we." He paused, then started again. "I apologize for our behavior. It was unwarranted and disrespectful." James nodded slowly, acceptance in his eyes, but something else too, a wisdom that came from understanding human nature in all its flawed glory. "The hardest battles," he said quietly, "are often fought right here at home, not with weapons, but with understanding and respect." The words resonated through the cafe, touching each person in their own way. Sandra wiped her eyes openly now, no longer trying to hide her tears. The young woman with the phone had stopped recording, realizing that some moments are meant to be experienced rather than captured. Marcus moved behind the counter and returned with fresh coffee for James and, after a moment's consideration, for the officers as well. The gesture spoke of bridge building, of the small ways people can begin to heal rifts. "Please sit down," James said to the officers, gesturing to the empty chairs at his table. "I'd like to tell you about the men this medal really belongs to." His voice carried no bitterness, no anger, only the quiet strength of someone who had learned that the greatest victory often lies in turning enemies into friends. As the officers slowly took their seats, the regular rhythm of the cafe began to resume, but something had changed. The morning light that streamed through the windows now illuminated more than just tables and chairs. It highlighted the invisible threads that connect people, the shared humanity that lies beneath uniforms and labels. James opened his notebook again, but this time he wasn't writing. Instead, he turned to a page filled with names, a list of his fallen comrades. Each name carried a story, a life, a legacy. As he began to speak, his words painted pictures of young men full of life, of courage under fire, of sacrifices made and honors earned. The cafe had become a classroom of sorts, where lessons about respect, dignity, and understanding were being taught not through lectures or sermons, but through the power of one man's quiet strength and unwavering grace. Outside, the world continued its busy pace. Cars passed by, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalk, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. But inside Carter's coffee shop, time moved at its own pace, marked not by minutes and hours, but by the gradual opening of hearts and minds. The metal on the table caught the light once more, its surface reflecting not just the morning sun, but the promise of what could happen when people took the time to look beyond their first assumptions, to see the humanity in each other's eyes. Officer Sullivan listened intently as James spoke, his coffee cooling untouched before him. Cooper had pulled out a small notebook and was writing, not citations or reports, but names and dates, recording history from someone who had lived it. The younger officer's face showed the transformation that comes when preconceptions crumble in the face of truth. Around them, other patrons lingered longer than usual over their coffee, drawn into the orbit of something important happening at that corner table. They witnessed not just the resolution of a tense situation, but the birth of something new, a moment when understanding bridged the gap between different worlds. Marcus watched from behind the counter, feeling a deep sense of pride in his cafe. Carter's had always been more than just a place to get coffee. It was a gathering spot for the community, a place where stories were shared and connections made. Today, it had become something even more, a place where change began. The morning light continued to shift, creating new patterns on the walls and floors, but the warmth in the cafe now came from more than just the sun. It radiated from the corner table where 4 men, 2 officers and 2 veterans, sat together, sharing stories and building understanding one cup of coffee at a time. James's voice carried softly through the cafe, weaving tales of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. Each word seemed to carry weight, not just from the gravity of the stories he told, but from the impact they had on everyone who listened. The medal on the table had become more than just a symbol of past heroism. It was now a bridge between different generations, different experiences, and different perspectives. Sandra Martinez had long since missed her shift at the library, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Like everyone else in the cafe, she understood that she was witnessing something rare and precious, the moment when prejudice gave way to understanding, when assumption yielded to truth. The young woman who had been recording earlier now sat with her phone forgotten on the table, completely absorbed in James's stories. Her initial instinct to document injustice had transformed into a desire to simply be present for this unexpected lesson in humanity. Outside, the morning had bloomed into full day, but inside Carter's coffee shop, time continued to move at its own pace, marked by the rhythm of stories shared and understanding gained. The metal that had started it all still caught occasional glints of sunlight, as if affirming the truth of each word spoken. And in that corner of the cafe, surrounded by the warm aroma of coffee and the gentle murmur of conversation, a small miracle was taking place. The kind that happens when people choose to see beyond their differences and recognize the common thread of humanity that binds us all together. The conversations in Carter's coffee shop continued well into the afternoon, the usual lunch crowd finding themselves drawn into the atmosphere of quiet revelation that had settled over the establishment. James's stories had evolved from personal memories of Vietnam to deeper reflections on community, understanding, and the invisible wounds that many veterans carry home from war. Officer Sullivan had long since radioed in to request coverage for the remainder of his shift, an unprecedented action that spoke volumes about how the morning's events had affected him. His partner, Cooper, sat with his notebook now full of hastily scribbled notes, not just about war stories, but about lessons in humanity that no police academy could ever teach. "You know," James said, his coffee cup long empty but still cradled in his weathered hands, "what happened this morning? It's not just about veterans or police officers or racial prejudice. It's about how quickly we can forget to see each other as human beings." His words carried the weight of decades of observation, of watching society struggle with the same battles he had fought in his youth, though on different terrain. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the cafe's floor, but the warmth in the room came from more than just sunlight. Regular customers who had witnessed the morning's confrontation had begun sharing their own stories, tales of misconceptions, of judgments made too quickly, of moments when they too had failed to look beyond the surface. Marcus had stopped trying to maintain the usual rhythm of the cafe, instead letting the day unfold at its own pace. He moved among the tables, refreshing coffee cups and offering quiet support to the ongoing conversations that had sprouted throughout his establishment. The Distinguished Service Cross remained on James's table, occasionally catching the light and sending reminders of its significance to all who saw it. Sandra Martinez had finally called the library, not to apologize for her absence, but to share what was happening. Within an hour, the library director herself had arrived, bringing with her a proposal that would change the trajectory of James's quiet morning ritual into something far more significant. "Mr. Washington," the director said, approaching his table with respectful determination, "we have a program for local histories, for capturing the stories that shape our community. Would you consider sharing your experiences with a wider audience?" James looked up, surprise briefly crossing his face before settling into thoughtful consideration. The officers at his table leaned forward, their own interest evident. Cooper, especially, seemed energized by the possibility. "Sir," the young officer said, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine enthusiasm, "this could be incredibly valuable for our department's community outreach programs. The lessons you've shared today, they're exactly what we need to hear." The cafe had become a crucible of change, where a single morning's confrontation had catalyzed something far more profound. Around them, patrons were no longer simply observers but participants in an ongoing transformation. A young college student had set up her laptop, documenting the stories she'd overheard. An elderly couple who had initially come for a quick breakfast had stayed for hours, sharing their own experiences of prejudice and understanding. As the afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting warm rectangles across the wooden floors, the atmosphere in Carter's continued to evolve. What had begun as a tense confrontation had blossomed into something approaching a community forum. People who had never spoken to each other despite years of sharing the same space were now engaged in deep conversation. James's notebook lay open before him, its pages visible to those nearby. The names written there were no longer just ink on paper, but had become living memories, shared with people who now understood their significance. Each name carried a story, and each story carried a lesson about courage, sacrifice, and the complex tapestry of human experience. Officer Sullivan, who had remained quietly reflective for much of the afternoon, finally spoke again. You know, in the academy, they teach us about community policing, about building trust. But sitting here today, this is what they were trying to tell us. This is what it really means. The medal on the table had become more than just a catalyst for change. It had become a symbol of the transformative power of understanding. Its presence reminded everyone that heroism takes many forms, from the battlefield courage it represented to the quiet dignity with which James had faced the morning's confrontation. As the day progressed, more people arrived, drawn by texts and calls from those who had witnessed the morning's events. The cafe had become a makeshift community center, where barriers of age, race, and profession seemed to dissolve in the face of shared humanity. A local journalist had arrived, drawn by the social media buzz that had begun to circulate. But instead of rushing to capture sound bites, she found herself setting aside her recorder, caught up in the organic unfolding of community transformation. She understood that some stories need to be experienced rather than simply reported. The afternoon sun continued its journey across the sky, but inside Carter's, time seemed to move at its own pace. The conversations deepened, touching on themes of prejudice, service, sacrifice, and the ongoing struggle for understanding in a complex world. James's quiet dignity continued to anchor the discussions, his presence a reminder of the power of responding to ignorance with wisdom rather than anger. Marcus had begun to realize that his cafe was becoming something more than just a local coffee shop. It was transforming into a space where real change could happen, where difficult conversations could lead to genuine understanding. He watched as people who might never have spoken to each other outside these walls found common ground over cups of coffee and shared stories. The Distinguished Service Cross caught another ray of afternoon light, sending a brief flash across the room. In that moment, it seemed to symbolize not just past heroism, but the kind of everyday courage it takes to bridge divides and challenge assumptions. The medal's presence had sparked a transformation that was still unfolding, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted when the day began. As shadows lengthened outside the windows, the energy in the cafe showed no signs of diminishing. New conversations continued to spark, new connections continued to form, and the simple act of listening, really listening, to each other's stories had become the order of the day. The morning's confrontation had opened a door, and through it had poured the possibility of real, lasting change in their community. James sat at his table, still the calm center of this quiet revolution, watching as his personal story became woven into the fabric of something larger. His weathered hands occasionally touched the metal that had started it all, but his eyes were on the future being born in this unexpected gathering of souls. The afternoon light painted everything in warm hues, casting a golden glow over the scene. Outside, life in the small town continued as usual, but inside Carter's coffee shop, something extraordinary was taking place. A reminder that sometimes the most profound changes begin with a simple moment of recognition, a willingness to look past our preconceptions and see the humanity in each other's eyes. As evening approached, the gathering at Carter's coffee shop began to naturally wind down, though its impact would resonate far beyond the cafe's walls. James Washington stood slowly, gathering his notebook and the Distinguished Service Cross that had changed so many lives that day. Officer Sullivan and Cooper rose with him, their body language now reflecting deep respect rather than suspicion. "Mr. Washington," Sullivan said, his voice carrying genuine emotion, "I hope you'll let us provide an escort home, not because you need it, but because we'd be honored to do so." James smiled, a warm expression that reached his eyes and seemed to light up the dimming cafe. "The greatest honor," he replied, "is seeing how a difficult morning can transform into something beautiful." He carefully pinned the Distinguished Service Cross back onto his veteran's jacket, where it caught the last rays of the setting sun. Marcus approached with a small envelope in his hands. "Mr. Washington, we've all talked, and we'd like to offer you something." He handed over the envelope, which contained a handwritten card signed by everyone present. "We'd like to make you our official storyteller. Every Wednesday, if you're willing, We like to reserve your table for veterans and anyone who wants to listen and learn." The elderly veteran accepted the card with slightly trembling hands, touched by the gesture. Around him, the remaining patrons stood in silent support, their faces reflecting the day's profound impact. Sandra Martinez stepped forward with a library schedule, already marked with dates for formal recording sessions of James's stories. "Sometimes," James said, addressing the room, "the greatest battles we face aren't fought with weapons, but with patience, understanding, and the courage to see past our first impressions." He looked at the officers, then at Marcus, and finally at all the faces watching him. "Today, we all won such a battle." As James walked toward the door, accompanied by the officers who had started the day as antagonists and ended it as friends, the cafe's patrons broke into spontaneous applause. It wasn't the thunderous kind that demands attention, but rather the quiet, respectful kind that acknowledges something profound has occurred. Outside, the evening had painted the sky in purples and oranges, a fitting backdrop to the day's events. James paused at the threshold, looking back at the space that had hosted such an unexpected transformation. Marcus stood at attention, offering a respectful nod, while others waved or wiped away tears. The metal on his chest caught one final gleam of sunlight as James stepped outside, a reminder that sometimes the smallest details can lead to the biggest changes. The door closed behind him with a gentle chime of the bell, but Carter's coffee shop would never be quite the same. Conclusion: the story of James Washington and the medal that changed everything didn't end that evening. It became a catalyst for lasting change in the community. Carter's coffee shop's Wednesday gatherings became legendary, drawing people from all walks of life to share stories and build understanding. The local police department instituted new training programs based on the lessons learned that day, with Officers Sullivan and Cooper leading sessions on looking beyond assumptions. But perhaps the most profound change was in the countless small interactions that followed. In the way people began to look at each other more carefully, listen more deeply, and remember that behind every face lies a story worth knowing. James's quiet dignity and forgiveness had shown them all that the path to real change begins with the courage to see each other's humanity, even in moments of conflict. The Distinguished Service Cross that sparked it all remained a powerful symbol, not just of past heroism, but of the everyday courage it takes to build bridges across the divides that separate us. In the end, the detail on the table had done more than change a moment. It had transformed a community, one cup of coffee and one story at a time.